Well, I was just going to say informally that the reason why we're happy to both have a full house here, and don't forget to eat your lunch, as well as live streaming, is that this panel is not only addressed to one of the more significant issues we face in education in the larger society, but we want to be able to do so with an interactive kind of conversation. So the presentations are really going to be kept short enough to kind of catalyze your thinking. We have at least one stand-up, maybe a second stand-up mic, and we hope that you, including those of you who are online virtually, frame your questions, and we can really kind of accomplish why it is we're holding such a forum. So a little bit more formally, I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, and on behalf of the AERA and our partner association for today's briefing, the American Academy for Political and Social Sciences, I'm pleased to really welcome everyone. Glad it wasn't yesterday, given what Washington was experiencing yesterday. As well as I've said, the really hundreds who've signed up online worldwide. Joining me from the Academy, and one of the reasons why I wanted to actually make these opening remarks, is a really good friend and dear colleague, Tom Ketchkamethi, who is there, and we've worked together for years, and he's Executive Director of the Academy, and we'll be making some closing wrap-up remarks, so I sort of took the prerogative of kicking this off so that, one, I could thank Tom and the Academy, who really brought the idea to the fore in a way that I think will reveal itself as the session unfolds. Those of you who are at least place-based have the insertion in the program, so if anyone wondered whether the scientific enterprise was flexible and adaptable, well, we did it. That there were two programming changes fraught by the weather. One of our presenters, Margot Jackson, and our moderator, Kenya Downs, originally scheduled, and who you saw in the invitations, just had weather challenges, to say the least, and complications that really prevented their being here today. They're probably watching online, I suppose. In their place, we're pleased to have joining us Susan Moffett at my left of Brown University, and co-author, so I might pick this up more than once. You should really, it's a great read. If you're a member of the Academy, you get access to, or subscribe to it, you get access to the annals. And in November, there was a special issue on the state of unequal education opportunity, the Coleman Report 50 years later. And, the Coleman Report has almost been kind of anthropomorphized as a term, kind of like the Coleman Report. Well, there was actually a fabulous 20th century sociologist who was one of my presidents when I was executive director of the American Sociological Association, who did really seminal work with a major specialization in the sociology of education, and one that thoughtfully catalyzes all kinds of conversations that are so important to the issues we are taking up today. It's not always the case that we have everything right, but building knowledge is a cumulative enterprise. And I said, as my dear colleague Bill D'Antonio joined us, who was an executive director of ASA, there are now a bunch of people in this room who actually knew Jim and were influenced in our thinking by them. I also want to really thank Sarah Sparks from Education Week, who thought we might be giving her a voice bite on the budget when we were giving her a voice bite this morning. Could you moderate? Because we just learned that we really wanted to have a member of the media, a journalist who knows the issues, moderate for us, and God knows she said yes. I won't go into a lot of background about AERA or really the Academy, but one of the things I wanted to say about AERA, now in its, 102nd year, I suppose we're approaching fast, is that our annual meeting in April has a foundational emphasis on public education and on social inequality issues. And so it's really nice as we roll out toward the annual meeting in New York, if anybody wants to take the metro up, to see the connections between the conversation that we're having here, the ones we're having at our annual meeting, and really the ones that animate discussions worldwide. The Academy, too, is dedicated to bringing social science evidence to bear on matters of national and international importance. Again, its flagship journal, the Annals, whenever I see that Annals, I know, oh, that's the topic I want to learn and read about. It really brings together some of the best scholarship and often major policy commentators around really big issues nationally and internationally. So this November issue was kind of a catalyst for us deciding to convene a more interactive conversation with the community once again. But the Annals and the work of the Academy does that so early and often. So I think it's fitting that the two of us as organizations joined together here. We were delighted as the American Educational Research Association to be asked by the Academy to collaborate on this. Clearly, the issues of education and inequality in education, the role of education in addressing or ameliorating or exacerbating inequality is a very core and central issue in society and in education research. I kind of hinted at this, but more than 50 years ago, when the Coleman Report was issued, it was not uncontroversial, or to put it not in the negative, it was somewhat controversial and continued to be, in part because, and quoting from the report, there was a central element of the report addressed the issue that the inequalities imposed on our children were more potent in terms of home, neighborhood, and peer environment than necessarily the school. The report rightfully sparked decades of research aiming at answering how, when, and why. And that's one of the premises of why we're holding this briefing today, because the knowledge has really accumulated in profound and useful ways for policy and practice, and yet we still recognize the need to continue to address these issues in ways that can make a difference. So we are pleased, and I am going to conclude, to be privileged to have not only a wonderful moderator, but an exceptional community of colleagues and bench scientists, bench scholars in our view, and really in the view of the social and behavioral sciences, to kick off this discussion. We are particularly grateful, as I said, to Sarah Sparks. We hope if your phones are on, you silence your phones, because a large part of this discussion will really be interactive with you and with those who have joined us virtually. So with that opening, let me both welcome and thank you for coming, and of course thank our panel for flying midst or taking trains midst various and sundry weather conditions to be with us in DC today. Sarah.
Thanks, Felice. So my name is Sarah Sparks. I'm the research reporter at Education Week. And we've been covering anniversaries of the Coleman Report since, practically since there was a Coleman Report. And it's nice to look back, but it's also important to see what exactly we're looking for. Some things you might not have heard in all of the discussions about the Coleman Report. I'm sure you've heard about the severity of problems from achievement gaps, from racial discrimination, from deep segregation of schools and of communities. But there were a lot of other details in the Coleman Report that often don't get talked about. It was one of the first major looks at motivation and mindset, how a student thought about themselves and their community within the school and what effect that had on their achievement long term. It was one of the first studies that asked teachers to take a test and looked at what teachers' content knowledge was and how they interacted with their classes. All of this is to say we've been looking at and researching and arguing about these problems for a very long time. And now with the Every Student Succeeds Act, we're going to have districts nationwide, many of whom are as segregated and as riven over these issues as they were when the Coleman Report first came out. But we will have a lot more districts looking for research and evidence-based practices to help them make a difference for their students. So I'm looking forward to seeing what our speakers have today in terms of talking about that. With me today is Heather Hill, the Jerome T. Murphy Professor in Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she studies policies and programs designed to improve mathematics teachers and teaching quality. Her recent research focuses on teacher professional development, instructional coaching, and teacher evaluation, and she is an AERA Fellow. After is Sean Reardon, to my left, the Endowed Professor of Poverty and Inequality in Education at Stanford University. His research focuses on the causes, patterns, trends, and consequences of social and educational inequality. I'm sure you've seen some big charts of his on the effects of segregation and poverty for students. He's a member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and an AERA Fellow. After him is Susan Moffett, Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University. Her scholarship focuses on the development of governmental and non-governmental capacity to put policy into practice, focusing on health and education policy. And finally, closing out will be Prudence Carter, Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. She's an expert on youth identity and race, class and gender, urban poverty, social and cultural inequality, the sociology of education, and mixed research methods. She's a member of the National Academy of Education and the Sociological Research Association and an AERA Fellow. Each of our speakers will present a little bit on their own work and their thoughts going forward, and then we will open it up to a Q&A. So, great.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd also like to thank Tom Ketchkamethi from the Academy and Felice Levine from AERA and their staffs who worked very hard over the last couple days to get everybody here and make sure that this event still went on. This panel considers broadly what the educational research community knows today about the causes or the reasons for children's unequal academic outcomes. And I'm going to start us off by asking the question that originally motivated this work over 50 years ago. Are schools to blame for the overwhelmingly unequal academic outcomes for American children? Viewed from a contemporary perspective, this is very much a live question still. Every day, media reports implicate schools and school systems for unequal outcomes, with those media reports citing unequal school financing, crumbling school facilities, and ineffective teachers. Reading these reports, it's easy to imagine a crushingly dysfunctional public school system, one in which schools themselves bring about steep declines in educational outcomes for children, low-income children of color. Others view schools as compensating for the disadvantages of poverty, offering educational experiences better than those typically available to children in their local environments. Discerning the relative truth in these views and ultimately the extent to which schooling writ large contributes to inequality requires reading a research literature that dates back 50 years to the Equality of Educational Opportunity study. Congress commissioned this study, also known as the Coleman Report after James S. Coleman, its lead author, as part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The study itself was massive, including 4,000 schools, 66,000 teachers, and almost 600,000 students. One of the largest standalone research efforts ever undertaken in U.S. schools. The study's equally massive final report, which clocked in at over 700 pages, confirmed what many civil rights activists at the time already knew. There was deep race-based inequality on tests of achievement. There were also disparities favoring white children in school resources such as smaller class sizes, school facilities, and the availability of advanced coursework. Surprisingly, however, the Coleman Report showed that these differences in school resources explain very little of the test score gap between white and African American children. In fact, these variables barely even predicted student test scores. Instead, as Felice noted earlier, family background, specifically parental income, education, wealth, and aspirations for children's achievement, proved more influential than the school-based variables. These results set off a seismic shock in the world of education research. Convinced that something must have gone wrong with Coleman's analysis, a large group of scholars started convening regularly at Harvard's faculty club for dinner, drinks, and data analysis. That's how we like to do it at Harvard, in that order, in fact. At the end of the day, however, their collective reanalysis of the 1966 data showed that Coleman's original findings stood. These scholars, however, also pointed out that Coleman's 1966 data was not sufficient to fully answer the question of whether and how schools contribute to academic gaps in the United States. What happened next and continued over the next 50 years was a concerted effort by those scholars and others, including the federal government, that resulted in 4 key advances in the field's capacity to answer this question. One advance occurred around ways to measure school-level factors that might contribute to student academic outcomes. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, scholars found a multitude of new school resources to count, from the types of books in school libraries to the square footage of classrooms. Yet these factors, too, largely failed to explain the between-school differences in children's outcomes. Instead, in the 1990s, a new generation of scholars began to develop measures that tapped the conditions much more proximal to students' outcomes. Things like parent-child interactions, childhood stressors, classroom instruction, and school quality. As our panelists will discuss, many of these metrics do successfully explain differences in child outcomes and have been used to partially explain our achievement gaps. More recently, scholars have found better ways to measure child outcomes, relying less on achievement tests and more on metrics that capture child well-being and later life outcomes, such as school attendance, school engagement, college enrollment, and earnings. A second advance toward answering Coleman's question involved the methods used to model student achievement. And excuse me while I become nerdy and technical for a minute. So in the 1980s and 1990s, scholars developed better ways to represent how the layered ecological systems in which kids exist. Kids live within families, they go to classrooms that are within schools, and families and schools exist within neighborhoods. And the goal of this research was to figure out the extent to which each of these levels contributed to child outcomes. The methods developed in this era also allowed us to identify the effects of specific variables within each level of the system. Finally, these methods were adapted to answer questions not only about kids' achievement status, i.e. how well they perform at a single point in time, but also to measure student growth over time. Looking at student growth provides a much more accurate view of the various influences on children's outcomes because scholars can see how that growth or lack of growth on the part of kids correlates dynamically with student and school-level factors that might explain kids' outcomes. The third advance that made answering Coleman's question possible was the development of new federally funded data sets like High School and Beyond and the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study. The latter study collected several waves of data that allowed scholars to answer Coleman's question by making clever use of an artifact of the U.S. school system, summer vacation. Comparing rates of student academic progress when school is not in session, scholars reasoned, to rates of student academic progress when school is in session would allow us to see the difference in how schools deflect children from their natural growth trajectories. With these data sets, the effect of schools on children's growth rates could be identified, and Sean Reardon is going to discuss some of the results of those studies. Finally, pushed in part by the establishment of the Institute for Educational Sciences, scholars began to design and test interventions intended to close the achievement gaps in the United States. These helped move the field from correlational evidence, for instance, observing that parent-child reading correlates positively with students' kindergarten readiness, to causal evidence, meaning we're much more sure that when we can increase parental reading to children, that their kindergarten readiness also increases. And Susan Moffett will talk a little bit about the results from some of those studies. In conclusion, there's still many unanswered questions in this field, including how historic structural inequality in the American economy and society contributes to unequal schooling outcomes, and this is an issue that Prudence Carter will take up. However, the field has made steady progress toward answering the questions Coleman laid out over 50 years ago.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. It's morning on the West Coast. I'm Sean Reardon, and I'm also want to thank Felice and Tom for organizing this and their staffs, and thank you all for showing up at your lunch hour. as Heather said, there are these competing views of the role of schools in American society and in relationship to inequality. So one view holds that schools are sort of the agents of the American dream, that is, they're what makes upward mobility possible, and so they are inherently equalizing opportunity. A second perspective holds that they're sort of agents of inequality, that because schools that kids from different backgrounds attend are very unequal in their resources, schools end up exacerbating social inequality. And in some ways, the Coleman report was trying to answer that question, which is a question with a long history in American education. And Coleman's answer to the question of how much schools matter was not much. That is, they were neither engines of opportunity or agents of inequality. They were sort of simply neutral and just reproduced the existing inequalities in broader society. So when Coleman did his study, he surveyed 600,000 students, tested 600,000 students, in order to come to his conclusions about academic achievement. I've been working on a study with a group of collaborators, and it's been facilitated in part by an agreement with the U.S. Department of Education that's helped us get access to 300 million standardized test scores. That is the standardized test scores of every student in public school in the United States over the last 7 years. So that's about 500 times more data than Coleman had. And so we're using those data to try to understand the patterns of educational opportunity in America and the role of schools in creating or reducing opportunity. So when we look at those data, what we can do is we can measure the levels of academic achievement in every school district in the United States. And I know you can't see the fine detail there, but that's about 11,000 school districts represented. The purple coloring represents school districts whose average test scores are well below the national average, and the dark green represents school districts whose test scores are well above the national average. And there's some obvious regional patterns and a lot of patterns that are sort of too small for you to see on that small picture. You can go to our website and download the high-resolution picture and browse it at your leisure. But what's unclear from this is whether that variation in average performance is a result of the quality of the schools in those different school districts, or whether it's a result of outside of school opportunities that differ across school districts in terms of family resources, neighborhood conditions, quality of available childcare and preschool, after-school programs, and things like that. So what we've done is we've separated out this achievement into two measures. One is a measure of the average levels of achievement children have in third grade, which is the earliest we observe their test scores, and how much their test scores grow within the district from third to eighth grade. And the first you can think of as a measure that largely reflects the kinds of opportunities children have early in childhood, many of which take place out of school. And the growth rate from third to eighth grade is much more reflective of the kinds of opportunities that children have in schools, or that are the result of schooling-related factors. And so that's going to help us say how much do these patterns result from differences when children are young that largely can't be attributed to school versus differences that occur in their opportunities while they're in school. So when we look at the growth rates, again, you won't be able to see this, but this is the map of average achievement. This is the map of growth rates, where green means higher than average growth rates and purple means lower than average growth rates. So if you look at Tennessee there, which is sort of purplish largely, most of the school districts in Tennessee have below average test scores in third grade, but most of them have above average growth rates from third to eighth grade. That says that what's happening in Tennessee is that on average children are getting to third grade somewhat behind their peers nationally, but they're learning a lot more from third to eighth grade than their peers nationally. So that suggests schools in Tennessee are, to some extent, an equalizing force relative to what they look like, say, in Florida, where the kind of opposite pattern is true. Now, I don't want to pick on Tennessee and Florida. Particularly, there's 11,000 districts, and the nice thing about the data is we can look at all 11,000 districts. So when we look at all the districts in the United States, so every dot here is a school district in the United States, and the horizontal axis is a measure of the average family background of children who attend the schools in that district. So it's a composite of family income and parents' education and poverty rates and things like that. To the right are the more affluent school districts. To the left are the poorer school districts. And I don't know if you can read the scale, but the most affluent school districts in the United States have average test scores that are about 3 grade levels above the national average in 3rd grade. And the poorest have average test scores that are about 2 grade levels below the national average. So there's about a 5 grade level difference in rough terms in 3rd grade. So there's an enormous amount of inequality in the kinds of opportunities children have had to learn in those kinds of communities. But what this doesn't tell us, again, is the extent to which that's due to schools or due to families. The other thing I'd say is there's lots of variation among the school districts. So this highlights the 100 largest school districts in the United States. And even among large districts that have the same level of socioeconomic status, there are some districts where average test scores are much higher than in other districts. That says there's something better happening in some communities than others in terms of education opportunity. But again, the question is how much of that is schools and how much of that is outside of schools. So what we do then is we break down all those school districts into a sort of 2-dimensional picture. And so the horizontal axis in this picture represents the average test scores in a district in 3rd grade. And the vertical line there in the middle is at 3, meaning those are the districts where the students have 3rd grade test scores on average in 3rd grade. That is, they're sort of at the national average. And to the right are districts where kids are doing better than the national average at 3rd grade, and to the left is where they're doing worse. The vertical axis is a measure of how fast children's test scores improve from 3rd to 8th grade, again, with the horizontal bar being the national average growth rate. So if you're up in the upper right quadrant, you're in a school district where kids get to 3rd grade with above average test scores, and their learning rates from 3rd to 8th grade are also above average. So those are places where kids are going to be doing very much above the national average in 8th grade. If you're in the lower left, those are districts where kids are getting to school with below average test scores and learning at below average rates, so they're going to be way behind by 8th grade. If you thought that schools just sort of reproduce the existing inequalities in American society, you would expect most school districts to fall in those 2 quadrants. They'd either have high opportunities early on and schools would exacerbate those and reinforce them, or they'd have low opportunities early on and schools would continue to create low opportunities. But what you see here is there's just as many school districts in those other quadrants as there are in the diagonal 2. That is, there are lots of school districts in the United States where kids get to 3rd grade with relatively low test scores, but then learn at a faster rate than the national average. Those are the ones in the upper left that used to be visible. And then there are also places where test scores are high in 3rd grade, but grow at a slow rate. Again, if we look at the 100 largest districts, they also sort of fall all over the map. If you're in a poor school district, however, you tend to get to 3rd grade with low test scores and have low growth rates. Though some poor districts have above average growth rates, and if you're in a rich district, you're sort of over on that side. So there's a lot of variation, and it suggests that there's not a simple answer to the question of do schools reduce or exacerbate inequality. One of the things we found that relates to the extent to which schools reduce or exacerbate inequality is how segregated they are. So districts with high levels of segregation, which are on the right of this picture, have much larger achievement gaps by race or by socioeconomic status than districts with low levels of segregation. So if we go back to Coleman's question and say, do schools change inequality? I think the answer is it depends on where you are. There are some school districts where schools appear to greatly increase educational inequality, and many school districts where they appear to greatly reduce it. That's not to say there's any school districts where schools seem to have eliminated inequality that exists when kids get to kindergarten or 3rd grade. But schools can be an agent an engine of opportunity, or they can be an engine of inequality. And the question is, how do we learn what are the things that those more effective school systems are doing so that we can translate those practices more broadly among society? Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Tom and Felice. And I also want to say a special thank you to Margot Jackson, who couldn't be here today, for all the work that she did on the volume. So building on Sean's work that demonstrates the persistence of educational inequality and the variation in the ways in which schools may redress or exacerbate that inequality, part of what the Annals volume strived to do was examine the evidence base for where do we go from here? What might policy do to help make things better? So I'd like to highlight some of the findings that have emerged from research in the years since the Coleman report, and discuss in particular some areas where research and policy have begun to become more integrated and provide us with other opportunities for future action. That said, I think it's important to remember just how deep and embedded our structural problems are above and beyond the policy interventions that I'll mention now. So what does research tell us? Where should we go from here? What are we already doing, and what are we doing in which we could build on further? So first and foremost, invest early in children. Evidence from many studies suggests that support during the early years of life, when children are in critical and sensitive periods of development before K-12 education starts outside of school, can benefit a range of children's outcomes. As we know, early childhood is a key period of development when circumstances have far-reaching effects that track into adulthood. But in particular, what works? There are positive health and academic effects from a number of child and family-focused investments, including public preschool, child tax programs, the nurse-family partnership, WIC, and school nutrition programs. Public preschools like Head Start and state pre-K programs focus on children's academic learning, their social emotional learning, and health, and studies provide evidence on how these programs have demonstrated impacts on children's outcomes. A separate body of research demonstrates strong positive effects of income support programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and nutrition programs like SNAP and WIC on infant health and long-term child achievement. And in particular here, I want to mention the work that Margot Jackson, the Annals co-editor, has done in this space. And her work finds that children whose mothers participate in WIC demonstrate strong associations with cognitive development and academic achievement later in life. But what else could we do above and beyond early childhood investment? Other evidence points to policies that invest across ages. One of the things that we worry about with our policy interventions is fade out for some programs, where benefits associated with an intervention decline gradually in the years after the intervention. Convincing evidence suggests that fade out is less pronounced and that interventions are more effective when combined and sustained with investments during school years. And in particular here, I'd like to point to evidence from Bo Jackson and Rucker Johnson and their work demonstrating that the effects of early childhood education spending, Head Start, are larger when coupled with higher spending on K-12 education. But what else should we do? There is also mounting evidence that finds promise in programs that engage and support parents through technology. Recent evidence from Susanna Loeb, from Ariel Khalil, and from our contributor to the Annals volume, Matt Kraft, suggests that well-designed text messaging programs can support parents of young school-age children in home literacy. These interventions have had large effects on parental involvement in school, home literacy activities, and children's learning gains. In particular, I want to mention a texting program that Susanna Loeb and her colleagues have launched. It has produced early literacy assessment scores that are 11% higher, of a standard deviation higher overall. And for children with the highest learning needs, their early literacy assessment scores are 31% of a standard deviation higher, suggesting potential for redressing some aspects of inequality. These programs provide promising examples of how research evidence from small pilot studies could be scaled in ways that are affordable, accessible, and support parents and children's learning. But what about the schools? Research from scholars, including Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and many others, underscore the importance of quality teachers to students' academic achievement and their long-term economic well-being. But what might be done to support instructional improvement? Here, evidence suggests that programs that feature both new curriculum materials and opportunities for teachers to study those materials in depth support instructional improvement. These programs allow teachers to think often with colleagues about how best to teach specific lessons included in the new materials. And the curriculum materials are often modest in scope, so they're units or supplemental instruction rather than year-long textbooks. This allows teachers to work intensively on revising manageable amounts of instruction. Also, programs that improve teachers' knowledge of the content they teach and how students learn that content also support instructional improvement. Here, for instance, high-intensity programs in which dedicated coaches observe and provide feedback to participating teachers 10 or more times in an academic year, so intensive, do appear to improve instruction and lead to stronger student outcomes. So evidence since Coleman suggests there are some promising policy alternatives, but yet deep structural inequalities remain well beyond the scope of these interventions, some of which Prudence will be talking with us now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hi. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I want to thank AERA, Felice Levine, Tom Ketchkamethy, the American Academy for Political and Social Sciences for inviting me to join you today at this briefing. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to share some findings from my own research and some general thoughts with you who are key thought leaders and decision makers about public education today. In my 6 3/4 minute, I want to situate my own sociological and educational research studies within this larger body of social science research findings that you've heard about, particularly as we continue to grapple with the prevalent and pervasive patterns of achievement disparities by race, by ethnicity, class, and gender over the last half century or more. But I want to step back because I always find it quite curious as we think about the Coleman Report in the contemporary era, more than 50 years later, that then we were talking about the power of schooling in the wake of Jim Crow and de jure segregation. And today, we're talking about the power of schooling in the wake of civil rights legislation. Then versus now is very important to consider. And while Coleman drew our attention to family influence at that time, which was significant, since particularly many African Americans, and those were the students of color he was talking about primarily at that time, were living in families whose parents were the descendants of slaves, who had, many of them were not even first-generation readers themselves. Today there was on Twitter a call for how many of you, what generation readers are you? And I thought that was a particularly interesting question because I realized on my mother's side, I'm just a second-generation reader. My grandparents were illiterate. And so there wasn't sufficient variation in the 1960s to even strongly compare black and white students from resource-rich families and schools versus their counterparts who were in poor schools. It was pretty much homogenous for African Americans then. And so it's not necessarily a surprise, I guess, for us to realize that schools didn't have much effect on African American students, although there were drastic differences in terms and variation for those who were white. But contemporary research tells us that the story about schools and family effects on academic outcomes is quite nuanced and complex. The contemporary research also evinces the enduring effects of greater structural issues such as poverty and racism. And it's important to use that word, racism. Nationally representative studies, like my colleague here, Sean Reardon. We've mentioned the economist Raj Chetty, whose work was just recently this week featured in the New York Times about intergenerational mobility. These studies with these large data sets point to the ecological dissimilarity between affluent and low-income students, and that affluence in that impoverished state or low-income state is highly correlated with race and ethnicity in America. In terms, and what we mean and what I mean, I'm drawing on the work of Robert Sampson, the sociologist of neighborhood effects, and William Julius Wilson. When we talk about ecological dissimilarity among various classes of students, we're talking about the dissimilarity in terms of their family, their community, and their school context. In today's society, we're asking groups of students, and I use this analogy, who have access to elevators moving at the rate of a bullet speed train. There are those who are on escalators, well-oiled cogs that are moving steadily up and up each floor, and those who are on stairwells with missing handrails and broken steps. And we're asking them all to get to the proverbial floor 16 at the same rate on average. If they don't, that's the achievement gap. But it is the opportunity gaps that drive the achievement gaps, the modes of mobility. And in American society, we have never gotten to a point where there is actually ecological similarity for various groups. And that is if the context did not matter. Then why is it that we wouldn't have more families just not caring about what neighborhoods they live in? So we just have to ask that question, and I'm going to put that there. But what the research is suggesting is that ecological and educational disparities are an outcome of a host of contextual factors. It's not an either or a both, but rather a both and. The Coleman report found some positive effects for African American students' performance, in particular when they were in school with white students. And what others and I have found in our research is that equal opportunity context within schools is not even guaranteed. Consequently, when we experimented with the project of integration, we didn't often find, some research didn't often find the kinds of positive outcomes that we anticipated. In research that I've written and is documented in what my last book, Stubborn Roots, as well as a fair number of studies, is that we can see that there's also unequal outcomes within schools that are so-called good schools because their test scores are good on average. Why is that? The unequal experiences of students of color and often low-income students in terms of tracking or ability grouping, limited access to AP and honors courses, the creation of territories out of different extracurricular activities that are often conducive to academic mobility. These processes of engagement are shown to have some association with overall academic ability. In so-called groups, good schools, and certainly in the research that I've conducted in schools in the U.S. and South Africa, we have found limited availability of access within schools that were actually producing highly extraordinary outcomes for affluent white and Asian students, but underperformance for African American and Latinx students, often from low-income backgrounds. Most of our nationally representative studies also, I would argue, and this is one critique of the Coleman report, have had limited availability of truly school-specific data and information versus aggregate district data that would illuminate the various mechanisms within schools that create these pattern outcomes by race, ethnicity, and class. That's why I go into schools as an interpretive and observational researcher, because we see them. But that kind of research has not been scaled on a massive level for us to be able to uncover them and then translate those into more valid and reliable quantitative measures. So I want to suggest to you this afternoon that we need also better indicators, and we need multiple indicators of students' educational well-being, not just test scores. The research is also showing that social, psychological, cultural, and political factors, sometimes intangible, but observable and felt and experienced when we are inside of schools, may either facilitate or impede the inclusion and equal educational opportunities for students, particularly those from historically socially disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, this comment pertains to some research that I've also conducted when we think about the degree and the high incidence of suspensions and expulsions in American schools that disproportionately affect African American boys, who we know now are sometimes 10 to 20 times more likely to be expelled or suspended, and later as adult men to be imprisoned. The Chatty research study that came out in the New York Times just this past week, from his large data set, we see that African American males on one particular given day, 10% of them were imprisoned. 10 to 20 times greater than any other race, gender group in the country. Black boys are less likely to be given the benefit of the doubt in terms of perceptions. They can't be mischievous. They can't be naughty. They're often criminalized as early as the research shows as 4 or 5. What are the implications for this kind of research on the long-term academic mobility? These boys and these girls oftentimes, too, suffer educationally, they suffer physically, they suffer spiritually. So in closing, I want to say that the holistic opportunity context, the systems from schooling do not look the same both inside and outside of schools for all groups. We've had ecological dissimilarity historically in American society. And any walls that attempt to separate what goes on outside of schools from what goes on inside of schools are an illusion. Contemporary research findings call for, they beg for, conjoining various effective social, as Susan mentioned, and educational policies and practices that will radically reduce the effects of poverty, and yes, racism, racial discrimination, racial inequality, that sounds more benign, on the lives of African American, Latinx, and Native American students' overall well-being. That's what I have to say this afternoon. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Before we go to open it up to questions from the audience, I just had a question. I mean, what we see both in the research and in the data graphs is really discouraging trends overall, but also a lot of very positive outliers. And what I'm wondering is, in each of your research, what you're finding about commonalities of those outliers, the districts that are able to prevent achievement gaps, the districts that are able to prevent resegregation in the face of public pressure. Could each of you talk a little bit about one example of that? And so we can.
So in terms of my own research, if you think about the outliers, and I guess the outliers would be the same ones as those students who are able to attend low-poverty, resource-rich schools and have access to all of the high-quality mechanisms that are available, practices that are available in the school. In my research, generally, I found that those students definitely did better on certain outcomes. They didn't necessarily do better on other outcomes. So when I talk about multiple indicators, I'm thinking about the academic tests and grades, but I'm also thinking about the social psychological, this sense of attachment and belonging, which research, experimental studies are showing they also matter. Now, the question may be whether one has more primacy over the other. What we did find in our studies is that you'd have a token few of students from historically disadvantaged backgrounds who could avail of those resources, but they were often isolated socially and culturally from their peers in those schools. And so that had some impact on their social relations, but I think many of us tend to prioritize the educational or the academic over the social. Why this matters is because in my research, I saw lots of students not wanting to sacrifice one for the other. They wanted both and. So when you ask about the exceptional cases, those tended to be what I call the mainstreamers who would assimilate or acculturate or tolerate isolation for educational mobility, academic mobility, or access. But there are a lot of kids who also who wanted to feel like they maintained their cultural integrity, their sense of self. They wanted to be able to feel like they belong so that it didn't affect their psychological well-being. And so they were more likely to not be avail. This is where agency comes in some ways.
Okay, so my main area of research is actually in teacher quality and instructional improvement, so I'm going to interpret Sarah's question. Oops, sorry. I'm going to interpret Sarah's question to say, are there outlier school districts that are improving instructional quality for children of color? And I've done work with several districts over the last 10 years or so, and I would say that I have seen schools that have been able, or school districts that have been able to do that. There's a couple features that characterize those districts. First, they are very intentional in aligning the instructional guidance to teachers. So instructional guidance is things like the pacing guide, the curriculum materials, the tests that are used to assess student progress. Districts that are able to improve instructional quality line those things up very, very carefully. So the teachers are getting the same messages and support for improving their instruction toward those tests or toward those standards. Teacher professional development in those districts is also lined up with those things. Districts that are less successful tend to add things on top of one another haphazardly. So the teacher evaluation system goes on top of a professional development system, and those two things do not talk to each other at all. So that's one component. The other component of successful districts, or districts that have been successful in improving instructional quality, is persistence. So the best districts that are able to do this, it's a 10-year process, really, and it takes a plan. So I've interviewed district coordinators who say, yeah, I came in the year 2000 with a plan, and here's what I did to execute my plan. And it really takes a lot of persistence along the same path to start to get some traction in improving instructional quality.
We've looked at a lot of different ways of measuring the disparity in outcomes between Black, Latinx, white students, or higher and lower income students. We've looked at that within districts. We've looked at that in metropolitan areas. We've looked at that in states. And the consistently strongest predictor of smaller racial achievement gaps, smaller economic achievement gaps, smaller differences between poor and rich districts in terms of educational outcomes, and a consistent predictor of upward mobility for poor folks in Raj Chetty's data. The one thing that's consistent in the answer to all of those questions is low levels of racial and economic segregation. So as a sort of structural feature of society, segregation, both racial and economic, seems to be a limiting force in terms of providing equal opportunity upward mobility. As Prudence has said, and says very eloquently in her book and when she speaks about it, segregation in the sense, or integration in the sense of getting children in the same schools or in the same classrooms or living in the same neighborhoods, is not a sufficient condition to create equal opportunity, but the absence of it is a limiting condition that in all of our work and in Chetty's work and other work we've looked at, in places that are highly segregated, you never see equal opportunity, and you see the achievement gaps grow as kids move through school rather than narrow. So I think if there's sort of one thing structurally I would focus on, it's that.
And my work builds on Heather's and has found some findings similar to Heather about the importance of the instructional coherence and the organizational supports that allow for instructional coherence. So the curriculum and the professional development and evaluations having some form of alignment and opportunities to learn the materials that you're going to teach, and also finding, similar to Heather, the importance of staying the course and not having lots of turnover, both the turnover of personnel as well as the turnover of policy. The other structural pieces that I would mention is some districts have a better or more harder time navigating the littered terrain of policies, all the different policies that they have to navigate simultaneously. And this also speaks to the issue of the silos that they have to navigate, not just the school silos, but other forms of governmental and non-governmental organizational silos through the provision of health and other related services. So the other area to continue to focus on is ways for meaningful structural arrangements that allow for better coordination of services.
So moving from the No Child Left Behind Act to Every Student Succeeds Act, there was a move to go away from prescribing specific interventions to letting districts and states experiment with them. And there was also a move to try to change the granularity of what we were looking at. Was it just student achievement test scores or systems and things like that? And I'm interested in what you guys think about where, since you were talking about persistence and the systemic policy issues, what level of granularity have we spent not enough time looking at? And what sort of capacity do states and districts have to dig into those areas? And this is for any of you guys.
What do you mean by granularity? Can you give an example?
As in student, teachers, schools, systems, states and districts.
Well, let me jump in, and I'll start because I've really thought about it, being from the state of California, where California went out to start thinking about multiple indicators for overall school quality very early on in the race, before ESSA was passed. And, you know, one of the measures is to try, one of the indicators is a school culture, school climate. A lot of that is measured through surveys that are disseminated to students. Some of that is also to parents. And one of the interesting things that one of my research teams saw very early on, the center I used to direct at Stanford, is that when we started to bring in these other measures, it recalibrated who was in the percentiles in terms of school quality. It just kind of recalibrated that, because there are schools that are high on engaging and incorporating students, but for various reasons, often pertaining to class issues, their test scores are not as high, but the students are sustaining and enduring. And so it's suggested, and there is actually a profile written by one of your colleagues, Christina Rizga, who writes for Mother Jones, where she profiles a high school in the Bay Area where the students, the overwhelming majority, go on to higher education. They do quite well in terms of getting to college, staying on the trajectory, but their test scores are not were not high. Many of them are English language learners. They come from poor backgrounds. And as Sean's data show, there's just a high correlation between the parent material context and the test score outcomes. But it does not suggest that the student didn't have the capability or the capacity to go on and thrive. So those schools were doing a very good job of cultivating the critical thinking skills, the writing skills, but the students were not testing as well. So we're seeing this kind of, if that's granular, we're seeing that kind of more specificity, that kind of detail as we bring in these multiple measures potentially.
So I would say, I would certainly agree with that, and I would say I think we need social policy that is targeted towards local patterns of the opportunity structure. So one thing that our data shows, for example, is that in some places, like if you're in the upper left quadrant of those pictures I showed, kids' test scores and therefore their early childhood opportunities are pretty low. But the growth rates of test scores and therefore the opportunities they're having to learn in the middle years are pretty high. So if I live in one of those places, I should be investing in early childhood opportunities, particularly for my most disadvantaged students. So if I'm Tennessee, maybe that's where I should think about investing my next marginal dollar. if I'm in the lower right quadrant, I ought to have a very different strategy. Kids are doing fine in 3rd grade, but they're not learning a whole lot from 3rd to 8th grade relative to other places, and that suggests my marginal investment in terms of improving opportunity ought to be in those middle school years. I ought to figure out what can I do to improve things there. And so I think one of the things about having kind of rich population level data, and ideally we would have it on much more than test scores. We would have it on a number of other kinds of measures of developmental processes. But having that data would let us do a much better job of targeting social policy to local conditions rather than a one-size-fits-all policy that says, hey, everyone should invest in early childhood, or everyone should invest in enhancing the curriculum in high school or something. It may be that some places are doing fine in one of those dimensions and not in others, and I think detailed data like this can help us do a much better job of sort of what you might think of as precision social policy or precision education policy rather than one size fits all.
I'll just add in my area, which is classrooms and schools, I think IES has done a wonderful job at helping us understand things like which phonics program works or what kind of cognitive processes kids go through when they're learning mathematics. And this relates back to what Prudence was saying, I don't think that the funded research right now has really focused on schools and districts. Helping schools achieve better coherence, helping districts do a better job in hiring teachers, scanning for talent, retaining teachers. And so we really lack evidence about how to intervene to make the kinds of schools that Prudence was talking about, how to transform a school that is not engaging kids into a school that is engaging kids with a school-level intervention. So that, from the research geek side of me, would be something that I would ask you all to consider doing more of.
And the research geek side of me, that's the whole research me, I think, would build on both of those points and have us, recognize the vast differences in state government and county government offices' ability to help districts, too. There's wide disparity within a state and certainly across states. So another area where we need further evidence that shows some promise is through different kinds of flexible networks for supporting districts, supporting teachers. There's a vibrant network space in California, certainly, that I think speaks to Sean's point about having interventions that are tailored to the specific district context, sharing best practices, as well as helping address different forms of isolation that a centralized structure doesn't necessarily address.
I could ask a lot more questions, but I want to open it up. Does anybody have questions? And is there if you could go there, there's a mic over there.
Hello, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Hi, my name is Anna, and I work on Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney's legislative team. I'm also a licensed educator in the state of Maryland, where I taught 9th grade English at the largest public school in Baltimore City. Thank you all for being here. It's so incredible that we have so much expertise, and I know it was probably an odyssey getting here. My question is about students with special needs, special education students. How have you seen, since this research was started with the Coleman report, have students with special needs, their services improved or remain the same? And you all touched on just a wide range of interventions, segregation, feeling social policies. I'm wondering, with your respective teacher quality, how you see those playing a role in creating opportunities for students with special needs.
I can answer it. I don't know the historic, I don't study this area, I don't know the historic panorama of this, but a little data that we have suggests that teachers who are work with special needs kids are less prepared in terms of the content knowledge that they need to be teaching. And so there's some within school disparity, particularly in middle schools, it looks like, and probably also in high schools, about which teacher gets assigned to which track of child. Which is a pretty significant problem if you're thinking about wanting to equalize opportunities for kids to learn from teachers. It's a great question.
One thing to think of is, at the time, there was very little mainstreaming for students with disabilities. I think now you're seeing a lot more research and a lot more interventions for teams of teachers, general ed and special ed working together, and what sort of training both sides need that you never would have seen back then because they weren't in school.
I just wanted to add, just last week I was on a panel with a scholar and a researcher who focuses on the visually impaired and those who are students who also have hearing impairment. And one of the things that she raised to my attention, brought to our attention, was the fact that the Common Core standards, the standards that we're using, are not often aligned when we're thinking about the visual and the oral. And she gave an example, and I was like, my goodness, how didn't we think about this? So I think it's really important and critical in the policy-making and decision-making stage that we have experts on those commissions who work with particular special needs populations. Because as that gets translated into the assessments, it completely ignores that students have different learning needs and learning styles. And that was something that was raised. And I was just astonished about it. She gave the concept of a sunflower. And many students write about sunflowers having seen a sunflower. If you're visually impaired, the student actually had tasted sunflower seeds, but had never seen. And so this was around literacy and the literacy assessment. But it was quite compelling. And the implication was who's on those commissions as we think about the development of standards.
Can we go to the next one?
Oh, yep. Thank you so much.
Do you have
I'm
a
good.
follow-up?
Nope, no follow-up. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Chris from Congressman Lipinski's office, and I used to be a high school teacher near Boston. My question is primarily for Professor Reardon. I was just really curious as to could you give us a better idea for what Tennessee is doing right and what Florida is doing wrong? So just a better account of the policies in each state that are leading to schools doing a better job.
I don't know. I've actually been thinking a lot about this, and I've just started to talk to folks about Tennessee because I want to learn more what they're doing. One of the sort of blessings and curses of doing this kind of research and having this kind of data is that it lets you sort of see this broad landscape in a way that we hadn't been able to before, that's broadly comparative in a sense. But it also, everyone I talk to asks me a different question like that. Like, so what's going on in Baltimore? What's going on in San Antonio? And it turns out I don't know enough about all 11,000 school districts in the country to answer that. So what I'm hoping to do is to sort of learn from folks and have folks in those kinds of different places kind of write about what they do, or try to sort of use the data to sort of tell us what's effective, tell us what seems to be working, so that then we can go back and maybe do more targeted research to try to test out some hypotheses. I know Tennessee has a very, from what I hear, a very well-organized State Department of Education that has a lot of expertise in the State Department of Education, has worked at it a long time. I think Susan probably knows more about Tennessee than I do, so I'm going to let her answer about Tennessee.
Yeah. And I can't speak to why Tennessee is different than the other states, but I will mention some things that I see in Tennessee that are impressive and I think should be modeled elsewhere. Going back to the original question about what helps us understand outliers, one of the things that helps us understand it at the district level is when a district or a school is organized as a learning organization, where the organization itself learns about what's going on and tries to improve it. That is what I see in Tennessee. It has organized part of its state government to learn what's going on. It has an impressive Office of Research and Strategy that works in partnership with university researchers. But unlike academic research that isn't connected with policy and practice, the research that they do are connected with Tennessee policies and practices. And so I think one piece to explore in the future is the extent to which Tennessee itself as a state has organized itself as a learning organization, and that helps us explain all the green on Sean's map.
Yeah.
And they try things and then they adjust, I think, is also a critical component of what Susan was saying. You know, they have had a history of strong state kind of initiated reforms, and when things work and don't work, they turn it around pretty quickly to change what they're doing, which is very impressive.
Hello, my name is Johan Rocha, and I work at the Inter-American Development Bank. And my question is regarding market demands for skills in education. There has been a shift towards kind of social-emotional skills and executive function, and some people say that, you know, maybe traditional skills aren't as predictive of success or productivity. I'm wondering, how's the school system adapting to these new skills, to these new demands? What do we make of tests that came kind of before this wave, and how will we measure them differently moving forward? Thank you.
Anybody want to, do you know, think that?
I would just be given an
I mean, your opinions.
Everyone is looking at me. I don't. So I mean, it's not my area of research. So understanding this is just trying to synthesize what. But I know that we would want other researchers here who work on social and emotional learning. We do know from some of the econometric research, some of the Jim Heckman's work, that there is a prediction that social and emotional learning indicators have long-term positive impact on the economic well-being of students. We know from the experimental research of social psychologists that social and emotional learning, certain indicators, there's a debate around grit. We talk about grit, but that grit is positively associated with certain educational outcomes. We know from the work of other social psychologists, we can call names like Carol Dweck, about flexible growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset. And there are some really interesting results coming out in math education about the flexible minds, about the growth mindset, because there is a socialization of youth, as we know in schools. Oftentimes, very early on, the narrative of about whether or not you're smart begins. And so the Dweck and colleague and teams have been are using interventions to encourage students to keep persisting, and and particularly girls in math. They've done studies on that. So we know that there are a lot of social psychology experiments in labs with smaller populations, whether or not that would test out in your data, which has, how many cases, 11,000 districts or 300 million. We don't know, and I don't know if we even have the measures for those things. But that is the hottest reform terrain right now in some ways, is thinking about the so-called non-cognitive. And there's a debate about whether or not that's even non-cognitive.
Can I say one thing about that? I think one of the things that the reason why we test so much in math and reading skills, for example, is that we've got 100+ years of experience in psychometric development of those tests. And so those tests do a good job of doing a very narrow kind of thing. And if we want to value, and if the market values a different or a larger set of skills, we probably need to invest the resources in trying to figure out good ways to kind of assess them at scale in the way that NAEP tries to assess a variety of skills. We measure what we value. So back in the 70s, NAEP used to measure problem-solving skills, and a NAEP assessor would go into a school and take a group of students and sit them at a table together and give them a problem and watch them solve it together and score them not on whether they got it right, but how well they worked together and what their problem-solving strategies were. NAEP also tested moral reasoning back in the 70s. Those kinds of assessments went out under the Reagan administration, but that is to say, we could assess more and different kinds of skills, but it takes a lot of development of the instruments to do that, to make sure you're doing them sort of validly and reliably, and that's a thing that governments can do. It's not a thing any local district can do by itself. That's a thing that the federal government is good at supporting, or state governments can support. And if we value things other than math and reading skills, and by God we should, we ought to figure out how to measure them to figure out whether our schools are doing a good job of teaching those skills.
I'm actually going to go to the front because she had her hand up from the very beginning but couldn't get back there. So, just speak loudly.
Okay, so my name is Camila from the Duckworth's office. In terms of higher education preparedness for public school students, what are some HPA recommendations that you all have?
Anybody, you would have someone, teacher maybe?
Preparedness for higher education?
Yes. So the higher education reauthorization that's coming up.
So what would happen in higher ed, so teacher ed? Or,
What is happening in teacher ed?
yeah, what would be recommendations?
Oh,
for
what
improving?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I do know actually a little bit about this. Yeah, you're all looking at me, and actually now that I know better the question, what the act is. So let's see. So there's been a movement recently in teacher preparation programs to connect more to practice. So rather than having students sitting in classes and learning theory, these teacher ed programs, especially like University of Washington is a fabulous one, or Vanderbilt is also doing this work, Michigan's doing this work, getting teachers to actually practice teaching in the context of their courses. So role playing, decomposing practice, trying to build skills in classroom management so that the first time a student says something unexpected, you're not looking at a teacher who looks terrified. Like, what did that kid just say? I wasn't planning on that kid to say that. Like, giving those teachers opportunities to experience unusual classroom events or have to lead a discussion. So that seems to be, there's some research evidence that suggests that that is producing teachers who are better able to teach when they walk into classrooms. They're more prepared on day number one. I would say, part of what I would urge people to think about if you're putting money in this direction is to really think about how to study these programs rigorously, because right now a lot of the research is anecdotal, and I think that we probably need a lot better evidence on how to prepare teachers at the outset for our nation's kids, because we don't have all of the answers that we need at this point.
Thanks. Just wanted to go to the online listeners. Are there any questions from there? Can we run over a few minutes?
Yes.
This is a question for Sean. What proportion of the variance in student achievement scores and grades 3 through 8 growth is between districts versus within districts? And how much difference would equality among districts make for the overall picture of inequality?
So good question. I'll repeat it if you didn't hear it. So the question is, how much of the variance in test scores is due to between district differences in test scores? And so how much would improving districts change the distribution? So there's sort of two things to think about. One is there's a lot of individual variation in students' academic skills. And what I focus on in my work is the part of it that's differences in average test scores. And so it's not clear that we would imagine that schools would reduce all the variance in students' test scores because of lots of difference in individual skills and interests and so on. So we don't expect everyone to be equally good in math or equally good in reading. But what we want is there not to be systematic differences that are based on where you grow up and the kinds of opportunities you have. So the socioeconomic status of a school district explains 65% of the variance in the between district test scores. So it's the correlation between socioeconomic status and average test scores in districts is about 0.8. So socioeconomic status is very, very highly correlated with it. Now, the socioeconomic status is only correlated at about 0.4 with individual test scores because there's lots of variation in individual scores. But socioeconomic status is very uncorrelated with the growth rates. It's only correlated at about 0.2. That is to say, poor districts don't have average growth rates that are that much lower than rich districts. A lot more of the variation seems unrelated to socioeconomic status. And so there are, as I showed you, lots of poor places that have pretty high growth rates. Chicago, a sort of example that's been written a lot about lately, has very high growth rates despite being relatively disadvantaged. So so the variance between districts is partly individual differences that we don't expect the school system to undo. But the part of it we would like the school system to undo is the part of it that's correlated with socioeconomic background. And that is about, as I said, about 2/3 of the variances between districts.
Thanks. We're going to take your question and one more online, and then we'll close out, and the panelists will be here if you have any additional questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Jordan Jones. I'm currently a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation intern serving in the office of Congressman Buddy Carter. First of all, thank you for the information. I'm very interested in education reform, so I think the research is very valuable. For my question, racism and segregation are issues that are very much so institutional. However, they are also proliferated by the mindsets of the individuals who hold these views and notions. So my question is, through your research or just through your everyday work, have you seen ways that we can combat or address the racial component of school inequality, since it's more so like a mindset issue?
Mm-hmm.
Let me just get this on. So one of the things that I did in my study actually was to examine the extent to which students were what I call socially and culturally flexible. And what by that I mean the propensity to want to relate to students who were different from themselves racially, ethnically, class-wise, in terms of various cultural tastes and such. And the interesting finding in this study is that in my study, I found significant differences in social and cultural flexibility for students, white students among white students by region. Northern students in the North were more culturally flexible than those who were in the South. But among the African American students in my sample, I actually found that there was more social and cultural flexibility among students who were attending majority minority, less resource-rich schools. These were all high schools that were doing pretty solidly well in their local context. Than the African American students who were attending affluent, white-dominant schools. And so I had to understand why that was. And one of the explanations possibly is that the students in the majority minority schools, while there were white students in those schools, they were in the minority, they were having more contact in classroom spaces and extracurricular spaces. The black students came to see themselves across the full spectrum of competence and engagement, from the smartest to the students who were not performing as well. They were in band and orchestra and chorus. They were in the language call, and they saw this in a multiracial space in a way. In the affluent majority white schools, it was more segregated. And this is why I say diversity is not integration or inclusion, because those students did not have the same kinds of opportunities within schools to kind of cross those boundaries, to cross those barriers. So it is the notion, social psychologists talk about group contact, intergroup contact, and why we need it to break through the kind of very rigid mindsets that are historically influenced, right there. And so what do we need to do? I fundamentally do not believe that we're going to move past, as Sean said, some of the inequality issues until we can get to deeper racial and class inclusion and integration in neighborhoods and schools. Because those mindsets will carry on even into the workplace in the long term if we don't break them early. And the schools that do better, I'm going to go back to the Chetty study that was mentioned this week in the New York Times, because what I was struck by too is that he said that the students, the black youth particularly, who did the best in this country across the census tract were living in areas where there was low racial bias and more opportunity. And I mean, he also talked about family structure as well, where there were more fathers present and stuff. But it was also low racial bias, because there were black boys who were living in affluent neighborhoods with two parents and going to the right schools, whose intergenerational mobility was not as great because there was high racial bias. And so we do have to attack that if we want to ameliorate the conditions of inequality in this society.
Thank you.
And we'll do a last question to online.
What do you see as the role of the school leader in working towards reducing achievement and opportunity gaps?
Either of you?
Well, I'll say this isn't my field per se, but I've been reading about it lately. So, you know, I don't know anything, but I play a person on TV who does, I guess. So one of the, you know, there was a lot of research sort of starting a decade or so about the importance of teachers, and you heard a lot then, like the teacher is the most important element of a kid's education and so on. But a few years ago, folks started to really study principals and school leadership. And there's a number of studies that I think suggest that principals are particularly important. And partly they're important because they shape who's teaching in the schools. They make decisions about hiring and trying to retain teachers and so on. Some of the people attribute the great success of the Chicago public schools in terms of growth rates to the fact, to their kind of school leadership model. I don't think the evidence is clear why Chicago has really high growth rates, but I think one plausible story is the fact that they have invested a lot in principals and school leaders over a number of years. So there does seem to be emerging evidence that school principals can be important for achievement overall and can be important in terms of equity producing, but I think that's an area of research where we sort of, there's suggestive evidence but not conclusive, and it's not clear exactly how you train principals to be better at those things. So I think there's still work to be done there.
I think we'll leave it there and turn it over to Tom.
I'm on. Hi. I'll be brief, I promise. Greetings from Philadelphia. I'm Tom Ketchkamethy. I'm the Executive Director of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, partnering with the American Educational Research Association here today. The history of the Coleman Report and the evolution of academic progress and policy and its aftermath is a telling one, not only because it's an object lesson in the ways in which policymakers and academics try to cope with uncomfortable truths about the state of educational inequality in the United States, but also because it reminds us how difficult it is to achieve social progress that is carefully considered and informed by evidence from the social sciences. And it's a complicated and nuanced terrain, and I commend Heather Hill's article in the Annals volume to you and Prudence's remarkable body of work if you're interested in knowing more about the strengths, weaknesses, and growth of education research in recent decades. Also, I must say that it's been entirely invigorating for me. We're not an education research organization like AERA is. We produce bi-monthly volumes that cover a lot of terrain. So I'm doing a volume coming up on evidence-based policy. We just came off of a volume on human smuggling. This month it's education. So I skate and I surf. And in this case, going into educational equity and inequality issues, in this way, it was remarkably invigorating to take this deeper dive into the literature, specifically because of the scholarly advancements that we've seen in recent years in the quality of contemporary evidence on the state of our union vis-a-vis educational inequality. Susan's work in that regard is, Sean's work in that regard is obviously an exemplar, and I found out over dinner last night that Susan just carries around in her head this encyclopedic knowledge of the literature that is most impressive. We do, in fact, know things, though. There is, in fact, settled science and an expert consensus on segregation, social mobility, educational equity, for instance, and a factual basis from which we can develop more enlightened and nuanced social policies and educational practices. There's lots more to know, of course, and we social scientists need to be exquisitely careful to stay in our lanes when it comes to making knowledge claims, but there is stuff that we know, and organizations like AERA and my own are here and dedicated to communicating that knowledge and that evidence base to people exactly like you. So it's a pleasure to be here. specifically because of all of that. Thanks for coming. Sarah, you're a rock star for being our last-minute moderator. Thanks for AERA to doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the logistics of this session today. We have summaries of the November Annals volume for you here, but much of what we talked about substantively is not contained there. For any of you interested in learning more about what we talked about today, Felice, AERA, me, my staff, we are more than happy to be your guides. We're easily accessible. For those of you who are interested in expanding your networks or connecting to communities of scholarship or colleagues nationwide who are expert in this terrain, we're excellent moderators, and I must say that high-flying academic types are, by and large, at least, a whole lot more accessible and cool to hang out with than they would lead you to believe. So if you haven't got lunch, get it, and thank you very much for taking some time in the middle of your day to join us. It's been a pleasure.